Hello. Welcome to another episode of The Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. Each week we both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about what we liked, what we hated, if we were scared, and maybe even some larger truths about why people watch horror movies in the first place. This season we're going to be focusing on horror subgenres and how they've changed over time. Hope you enjoy it, and thanks for listening. All right, this is week 4 of our mini-series about cults. We started with a couple of older movies and then did a week where we talked about some real-life cults. And this week we're going to dig into a movie that feels like a pretty good example of a film depiction of how we think about cults in the modern world. But it's also horror, so there's a supernatural element as well, which is less verified in the real world. So, real talk, when we first started talking about doing a mini-series on movies about cults, this is the first one that came to mind for me. Children of the Corn is a movie that I've seen a bunch of times. It has a billion sequels. And do you think this is the most well-known franchise about a cult?
Franchise, I would say it has to be top.
Yeah.
I mean like when we were doing research to try to find them, like, it was almost annoying how often this came up.
Or one of the sequels. Results. It's just like, yeah.
So I would say it has to be.
Yeah. So the cult franchise, that's what we're digging into here this week. So had you seen this one before?
Yeah, but I hadn't seen it until when I was at the apartment on 3rd Street. So like,
the past 8, recent.
Yeah. Not maybe like 5 to 8 years ago.
Yeah, what is time? But this was based on a Stephen King short story from 1977, which would have been, well after the Manson family murders, but also right around the time that all the accusations against Jim Jones were starting to get published and gain traction. So think of that as kind of like the input to the writing process of Stephen King. And then it's really not surprising at all that this story is what came out of that.
Greed.
And yeah, it's pretty wild. And I think, especially after last week where we talked about, some of these real life cults and kind of some of the patterns that you saw and everything else, it really brought home how relevant this movie is to like the modern depiction of cults in horror movies. So
I agree about that. But I also want to say, after watching the real life cult, it definitely made watching horror cults easier on my soul. Just like, thank God this is all fake.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and at least there's a chance the bad guys will get what's coming to them in this one, right?
Yeah, because that was like a legit thought I had where I was like, okay. Like I almost took a deep breath. I was like, thank God.
Yeah.
This is all fake.
So yeah, I'm going to do a quick introduction, then you can do some fun facts, and then we will get into the continuity errors with the blood stain on Bert's shirt details.
That's fucking perfect, Daniel. That's a 10 out of 10.
In 1984, New World Pictures brought us Children of the Corn, a low-budget film adaptation of the Stephen King short story of the same name. This movie tells the story of a young couple road tripping across Nebraska who stumble upon a cult of children living in a forgotten town among the cornfields. The only thing scarier than their creepy leader Isaac is the mysterious creature who walks behind the rows. Reports differ on the budget for this movie, but it was most likely less than $3 million, and it made well over $14 million at the box office. The original Children of the Corn can be streamed for free on Tubi or on Amazon Prime Video at no additional cost to Prime members. What did you learn about this movie?
March 1997, the men's softcore pornography magazine Penthouse ran a peculiar story by Stephen King about a ghost town in Nebraska where a generation of creepy children worshiped the corn. The next year, Children of the Corn would be published by King's short story collection, Night Shift. Short, especially by King standards, but chilling. But the chilling story was adapted to a feature film in 1984. No one expected a few thousand words about Scythes, and ears of corn to turn into 11 movies, let alone one starring Linda Hamilton. But here we are. So this started in porn mag.
Yeah.
70s.
Weird time, man.
No, man. Disciples of the Crow was the name of the... Fuck, God, ignore that. Look who's editing this one, Daniel. The actor who played Isaac, John Franklin, was actually 24 years old at the time of filming. Gotta say, not that charismatic. The original trailer actually misspelled Stephen King's name. Spelled it with a V. I said there's no V in King. So this is the last fact I have. I just like, this is like what I like. I like the universe. I like those kind of things. That's just nerdy, I guess. In the Stephen King universe, the town of Gatlin, Nebraska is near Hemmingford home where Mother Abigail lived in The Stand. In the movie, it's referenced as Hemmingford. And that's the facts I got for the show.
So this one is interesting because of the way that it sets up the cult in my mind. It kind of has like the narration in the beginning of one of the kids, and they kind of have this flashback of when there is a corn drought and people are getting more desperate, but also he talks about being the only kid in church that day because all the others were out in the cornfield with Isaac. And so they're already, like, from the opening lines of the movie, foreshadowing that there's another thing going on and that there's this character named Isaac and that all the kids are, being led by him more than by their parents. And so then you get that super gnarly scene where you first see Isaac standing outside the diner looking in with his creepy hat, and then the older kids in there all start murdering all the adults. And it was interesting to me because it was almost like you were coming in like at the tonight's the night we kill celebrities night of the Manson family. It wasn't like anything about how the cult developed over time really, or about how their beliefs evolved or anything. It was just, you were right in the middle of, we're already at the point that the cult members are branching out and destructive to other people. And so I think that part of the effectiveness of that, or for that to be effective, if that movie had come out before the Manson family, it would not have been nearly as obvious as what it was going for at that point.
That's a good point, man.
Because I think that anyone who's ever seen this movie has immediately like kind of made those types of connections, right? To the
yeah. You have to. I'm not that smart, and I even did.
But it was also like super visceral, right? Like the way that scene, and when they were putting the old man's hand in the meat grinder and stuff, like they were not really pulling punches. It was clearly meant to shock you with how violent these kids were capable of being, which I think, reflects, obviously they have some kind of like crazy extreme belief. And this guy, Isaac, is the one who's in the middle of it all. So I thought that was a really good way of setting up what this movie was and what it was going to be before they went back to try and like introduce other characters and kind of start to add the narrative and all that.
Yeah, and I know that at the time they didn't realize that there was going to be like 1,000, follow-ups, but
yeah,
I could easily believe that if they're like, hey, we'll get into the beginning of how this got here in a follow-up film.
Yeah.
In the 70s, I don't think they would have thought that, but I definitely like getting straight to the action. I'll never complain about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Another scene that I thought was really interesting was all the stuff with Amos, who, and through his story, you kind of find out that they have this ritual that on the first night of your 19th year, you carve a pentagram into your chest and let other people drink the blood and then walk out into the field to be eaten by he who walks behind the rows. Like there's this whole mythology, right? Like you don't really get a lot of detail on the specifics of their beliefs. You just get kind of enough to make it really creepy.
Yeah, it's funny. I guess I missed the 19-year-old part. That's definitely something I would have wrote down just because it's gnarly.
Yeah. So the idea is like no adults, like even our members can't grow up to become adults because we're only kids. But that also seems like a somewhat self-destructive philosophy for a cult.
It definitely doesn't seem like a lasting cult.
Yeah, exactly. There was a recurring theme in this movie, though, that really caught my attention, and that was Bert fighting children.
Yeah, go on.
Which I love.
In.
Because a lot of times in movies, like for the plot, the main girl can get away from, the giant superpowered serial killer just because it's convenient to the plot. It doesn't make any sense. Like she kicks him in the leg and all of a sudden he falls on the ground and holds his knee, like he's a pro wrestler or something. Yeah. But then the rest of the time he's getting like shot and it doesn't phase him, or getting hit with a bat and it doesn't slow him down. And so like it's inconsistent. But in this one, there were a lot of scenes where Bert was like surrounded or he was like fighting and then he gets away. But that's because he's a grown ass man fighting against children. So it was totally believable. Like if you had a bunch of 11-year-olds surrounding a grown man, do you think he could get away? Yeah, probably. Doesn't stretch my imagination. Oh, yeah.
You guys have all the 11-year-olds in the world. I can still get away.
Yeah, right. But yeah, it was pretty wild, and it was definitely.
I really want to fight 11-year-olds right now, Daniel. Like I'm that point in my life where it's like, I hope they show up.
You just want to test yourself.
Okay. So I get it's difficult to fight these kids. The only thing I could think of what would allow it to happen is just that supernatural weirdness that's going on, right? There was too many like close calls for that to happen. But also, if your fight is in a cornfield, it's every man for themselves.
I think
everyone knows that.
Yeah, you don't got a long way. You can't really see what's going on. You just got to fight for survival.
Those are street rules of the corn fight, and if you're going to be in corn fighting, that's what you got to do.
Yeah.
I did also like the fact of how they got to the city itself. Like it was like, they were basically driving the circle. And I know that I feel like that's kind of played out, but I almost feel like it's kind of played out just because of like our age. Like I felt like that was like a huge thing in the 90s. Like people kind of getting stuck, like things you would see on like Tales from the Crypt or like, I don't know, insert
wrong
whatever
turn.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's just like that was so kind of common that I feel like it's a thing, but I don't necessarily feel like I see it as much anymore. So I did like how they got there.
It felt
there's
pretty
no other choice.
Yeah, it felt pretty believable in this one. Like the idea that the signs have been moved around and now you're just going to kind of end up in this place because all roads sort of lead there.
There's no point of contact. Like you're seeing corn all around you. There's nothing like no reference.
Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty wild. And the fact that they were also like getting frustrated with each other as it was going along, and it was like they were trying to avoid the town, but they just kept kind of ending up back in that area, gave it a sense of like inevitability that was creepy all on its own.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, that's real too. Like if couples argue like that, like when lost or travel, like that's a real thing. So I was right at home.
Yeah. Yeah. I also was interested in the scene where Isaac was like preaching, and he's saying that he who walks behind the rose told him that the Outlanders are coming, who are non-believers, and that they should be sacrificed. And it seems like he probably spends a lot of time with the people or the kids just sitting around listening to him talk about whatever he wants to talk about. But you get the feeling that like Isaac is being deliberate, but he also has a very kind of sincere quality to him. Like I felt like in this movie, he wasn't depicted as craving power. It seemed like he really believed in the creature and thought that what he was saying was true and what he was telling everyone was the best thing to do.
Yeah. No, I was going to say something similar. Yeah, he absolutely believed it. Because like even at the end, he's saying like, I did what you told me to do, basically. Yeah. And so like he believed it inside and out.
One thing I thought that was interesting too was the whole Malachi seizing power. That kind of reminded me of what we were talking about last week with the main guy from yours, Brother Julius. Was that the name? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how when he was kind of like done, there were other people who were trying to take over. And it really seemed like they both just wanted to be in charge, not that either of them thought that there really was like some sort of higher power that they were representing or anything. It was pretty human desire for power.
Which makes sense from the point of like with these cults, like especially like with the work, like I felt like he developed that charisma as time went on, or like developed the following as time went on.
Yeah.
And you know, so if you have like, let's say 15 years with this one guy, you know, who's like kind of shaping who you guys are, and then all of a sudden you have this any new leader come in, it's going to take time to like, they have a whole new leadership style. They have a whole new, you know, like Paul got arrested for money laundering, 3 million in money laundering. It's like there are new rules that come in place. So there's definitely going to be like an uncomfortable period with the change. So I'm glad that they included this in this film, because that's 100% legit.
So yeah, Malachi kind of decides that he's going to take over and seems to be successful just because he's like the tallest kid and can beat up Isaac. But
that's so childish, but it's true. You're the leader. Why? Because you're tall. That's how it would go down. I love that, dude. Legit.
But then I loved the turn where like Bert shows up and gives everybody the speech while he's freeing Vicky, and then Malachi's like, no, you got to fight me to win. And then Bert does win because, again, he is a grown-ass man fighting a child. Like, there's no other way that was going to go. But I guess to some extent it makes sense that Malachi is used to being the biggest, baddest person in the group. Like, in his mind, he's undefeatable because he's even just thrown over, like, the leader of everybody. And so he thinks he can do anything, and then he gets a little knocked back to earth, which I think is probably good for him in the long term.
That's what happens when you're surrounded with yes men.
Exactly.
You're gonna get hit. You're gonna get hit. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know this movie was made on a very low budget, and I feel like there were some areas where it did well despite that, and other areas where it really suffered because of it. One area where it did well despite that was when Isaac came back as like zombie Isaac. Like, I guess he was possessed by the one who walks behind the rose or something. But then he comes back and attacks Malachi, and he was super creepy, and like the visuals and the sound and everything about that, and just adding that element of like real supernatural stuff to this movie, I thought was kind of cool. And frankly, he was way more convincing and terrifying as an enemy than the weird, like, staticky visual effect that they were doing for the creature.
The static was definitely messy. It was also the 80s, so like you see where the messiness came from. But I couldn't agree more with the look of that kid. It worked.
Yeah. And it helped that the actor was like naturally creepy looking. So good casting, I guess. But
what was the continuity? I guess I didn't notice.
With Bert's shirt. Okay, so when he got stabbed, he had like that blood stain. Yeah. And then there's a bunch of shots of him like running throughout the town, and like how far down the blood stain went, how dark it was, like everything. It was all over the place, and it just was cracking me up.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
So, anyway, worth watching for if you revisit this one. But another scene that I thought did not go over well was when Bert was running with the hose, and then he starts getting attacked by corn stalks.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's one of those things where you type it. It's like he starts getting attacked by corn, and you're like, yeah, that is what's happening, isn't it?
That's where we're at with our lives right now. Yeah. Which I'm sure, like, in the book made more sense, but
yeah. Well, in the book, it was up to your imagination. Like, you could make it creepy, but in the visuals, you know.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, so the whole thing culminates with Bert feeding gas a hole into the irrigation system and then using a Molotov cocktail to light it off. And somehow this giant creature, this amorphous static blob that floats around in the cornfields, catches fire and is vanquished. And so then Bert and crew go back to the car to get the map, and then the girl attacks him with a scythe, jumps out of the back. But then, of course, it's not much of a fight, and he knocks her out because grown man fighting a child.
Yeah.
So, jump scare, punch, done, and then they walk off to the other town. So this one was interesting. I feel like it sort of a little bit relied on the audience's kind of knowledge or acceptance of the modern definition of a cult to not have to fill in too much about like the background of it or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it fits well into our list of the 4 attributes of cults, sort of as they were thought of in the modern world. So like the authoritarian control, the extremist beliefs, the isolation from society, and the veneration of the single individual, I think all were like very present in this movie in ways that they weren't for the last 2.
That's like check.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, we have discovered the formula.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I guess the last thing I had in my notes were, this one definitely had, like, I feel like we have some horror cult tropes that are emerging. So like the inner turmoil in the cult. And we saw that with The Devil's Reign, where you sort of had the people who had acted against the cult, and now the entire group is after them for all of eternity. And then in this one, you had sort of the cult against Job and Sarah, but then also Malachi against Isaac, and sort of the internal politics of it were as much a danger as anything else. And I think an important part of cult movies too is just this, it's almost like the story's being told from the perspective of an outsider that gets wrapped up in it. So like with this one, for the cult to really be scary, you had to kind of be discovering it through the eyes of 2 people who all of a sudden found themselves in the middle of it.
Yeah. That's a good point. I guess it would be a totally different story if they were already part of it and trying to get out. But still, I like that thought.
Yeah, like if the whole thing was from Job and Sarah's perspective the whole time, it was like, well, they'd kind of already known what they were into and knew how to navigate it and everything else. Like it was much more striking when you have 2 outsiders come into it,
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, was there anything else you saw in this one that reminded you of your cult episode from last week?
So it's a little bit different because I feel like the work, which was the cult that I did, was a little bit like, I guess the reason why they didn't want to leave was because of like the fear, or like maybe the shunning and things like that. This was more like on a physical level, or like you're going to die kind of thing.
Yeah.
These cult members didn't think that was the case. So I would say maybe a tiny bit, but the work done by the Sinful Messiah, Brother Julius, was just such a strange cult that it's hard to compare.
Yeah. Yeah, I think definitely the details of it, like the beliefs, the specific beliefs are a thing that we've seen pretty different from cult to cult.
Yeah.
It's almost like they find kind of their niche that is different enough from things that people are attracted to it instead of just like normal church or something. That allows them to kind of, start to form this community, which then is sort of the beginning of all the other stuff that can grow from that.
Yeah. Yeah. What about similarities with yours? Was that what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely kind of the broad brush formula was there. I think that, it kind of started from this one charismatic person, but you didn't really like the whole progression was the thing that I saw as being really different, where, with Jim Jones, you can see very clearly how he went from like kid who wanted to be a preacher to preacher of a small congregation to got that congregation to move to an area where they attracted more members and got more money involved. But also he was able to start this sort of, hippie commune style lifestyle that he was in charge of. And the way that it all just kind of grew. Whereas with this, you were just like right in the middle of it, sort of at the point where they were, it was almost like this movie just dropped you right into Jonestown. You know, I feel like what was going on here was much more like what happened after they were outside of the main parts of society and things were really starting to get dark. So yeah, definitely similarities with how these things grow and progress. I think that we've found ourselves firmly inside the formula of what a lot of cult movies are going to be from this point forward. And so hopefully the next couple of weeks are going to let us take a look at some movies where the filmmaker has taken sort of this established idea of what a cult is and then started to do some creative things with it from a horror movie making perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm excited to get into like what the majority of our listeners are like familiar with as far as cults go. Like movies definitely. That we probably have seen before or familiar with already, and so we can understand it a little bit more. I like how we started with the older ones just to see where it came from. We got to know or see how it started, I guess. And so I'm glad we started with that, but I'm definitely looking forward. Like I was looking forward to this week. I was looking forward to the next couple that's coming out. And there's just something special about a horror film that has like the soundtrack, like it's a children's adventure film too.
like an 80s made for TV movie.
Yeah, man. Yeah, but like for kids too. So it's like I know I heard that music somewhere, but
yeah. And Linda Hamilton, can't go wrong.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, Sarah Connor. That's my Arnold Schwarzenegger impression.
Her singing that "School Is Out" song towards the beginning was one of the most awkward few minutes of film I've ever seen. That was
and all I could think about the whole time was her just screaming in Terminator 2, "You're all gonna fucking die! We're all dead! You're dead, I'm dead!" How many 11-year-olds do you think the Terminator could take out?
As many as he needed to.
Yeesh.
And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com, or feel free to comment on or message our Facebook page. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.